Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is Gunnerkrigg Court, Chapter 60, The Other Shore.
Hello there.
And this is the beginning of the 7th book, and the second in the two-parter that began with Jean.
So it was a true cliffhanger.
It was a very conscious cliffhanger to end the book on, yeah. Normally I would end the books kind of around the summertime for the kids and wrap things up, but this time I wanted the plan to be separated into a two-parter, and I was coming to the end of the book anyway, so it was pretty natural to make this into a full-blown cliffhanger. And the last thing we saw was that Kat had somehow entered into this realm that Annie was part of, and Annie at the moment is trying to figure out the arrow that's keeping the elf boy stuck to the bottom of the river. But since she took so long, Kat had to intervene, and this caused her to enter into the same realm as her.
So the first thing I wanted to ask about Kat's ability to see the ether in such a mundane way is, if someone else who had no connection to the ether, like Kat does, like her father, Donnie, if he were to force his way into the ether like Kat's done here, would he experience it the same way, or would anyone with no connection to the ether experience it the same way, or is this a special ability of Kat's?
Well, this is pretty unique to Kat. Her power, as it were, is to just see the situation for what it actually is, without all the set dressing around it. And just like we saw in the chapter where Mort was exiting the comic, Kat does have a very different perspective of the stuff that's going around that the other characters would perceive to be etheric or magical. And when I was planning this for Kat, the thing that I kept in mind mainly was that Kat would be able to look at something and understand how it works, whereas somebody else might see a device or an object as working through magic or not really understand how it works. So while somebody might look at a modern mobile phone and not understand how it works and think that it just works on pure magic, Kat could look at the device and understand exactly how it works, and to her it's just another piece of equipment. And so that's exactly what she's doing here.
So does that sort of imply that in the ether there's a function whereby what's going on in it is dressed up for the benefit of whoever's looking at it?
A little bit, yeah, and that's exactly what was explicitly mentioned in the Realm of the Dead, where the vampire guy explained that some of it is a bit of set dressing and it is a function of keeping things mysterious and magical, but that doesn't pertain to everything. So here, Kat's abilities are providing a counterpoint to Annie's and helping her out at the same time. And also I just like leaving certain details to the viewer's imagination, and I actually call this out a little later. And while this is going on, Jean and Parley are actually fighting face-to-face out in the real world.
I'm a little worried that it might be hard to discuss this scene because I think the pages flow together pretty well as an action scene, and it's a little bit more difficult to take a single moment out of there and dwell on it.
Yeah, because the fight is a prolonged sequence of events, there isn't really any one particular part that I feel needs to be focused on when talking about the chapter. And at first, when I was planning the chapter out, I was a little reluctant to have extended pages of action, because in the past that's not really been the strongest part of the comic when I've tried it. But the fact is that there was a fight going on here, and that was an element of their plan, and I needed to show how not only is Jean a threat, but Parley is at the point where she can at least run interference and keep her at bay while Annie and Kat are doing the rest of their plan.
Was Jean's clothes fun to draw? Because it looks fun to draw.
Yeah, it was nice to draw her as a sort of amorphous shape flowing around, and it also made it a lot easier to indicate the direction that she was moving in. Since there is no animation on this page, I was able to use the direction of the material of her gown that she wears to indicate movement in the pages. But then also there is a reason for why she's wearing such a large gown, as we'll see again a bit later. So back to Annie and Kat, this goes to something that I mentioned earlier, in that I like to keep things open to interpretation. And I call it out directly here with Annie saying that with Kat picking up these lockpicks that Annie's provided and then undoing what Annie perceives as some sort of etheric locking mechanism, Annie can't even describe what's going on. And so instead of having to figure out a way of drawing that, I just take Kat's point of view and make a joke out of it instead. But because this whole sequence of events does involve different characters doing different things in different areas, it is going to switch back and forth between the various groups of people. And I tried to keep the chapter a balance of those scenes. I didn't want to front load it with just Annie and Kat's point of view or with the fight with Jean and Parley. And I really wanted to show that what Annie and Kat were doing was affecting Jean directly. And so in this last panel here, where these green lines are coming in and stabbing at her head, the green is, I hoped at least, clearly an indication of what was going on with the lock and the arrow, since that's also tinted green. And so, thanks to Kat's help, Annie's able to exit the arrow and then remove it from the skeleton at the bottom of the river and watches it tumbles away with the current.
So is there anything you want to say about the design of the arrow?
Well, I guess it's worth pointing out that the reason that the arrowhead is so strangely shaped is because I was basing it off an obscure type of arrowhead that in some places is called a rope cutter arrowhead. It's very flat and broad and has 2 prongs at the front, but it's actually very unlikely that they would have been used to cut ropes. But I've also seen it speculated that those types of arrows were more used against horses and other large animals since they would cause a much bigger wound. And I kind of wanted to use it for the design of this arrow because not only is it a particularly cruel looking device, I always imagined it as a prong that would keep the target pinned to the bottom of the river. And so I just thought it was an interesting arrowhead shape to use in this particular case. And so with their part of the plan finished for now, Annie and Kat head back to the shore where Jean and Parley are still fighting.
Did Jean in her life have any etheric powers, or was she just a normal person?
No, she was just a regular person. So she was aware of people who had powers like that, but she herself didn't have any. And in this scene where we still see them fighting, I do actually change the perspective more to Jean's side because I wanted to show that she is working things out in her head and figuring out what obstacles are coming up in this fight. And she's identifying them and trying to figure out on the fly how to deal with them. And I wanted to do this to show that she's a very experienced fighter and someone who is very cold and calculating, but not because that's her personality when she was a human, but because that is all that's left of her right now, and just her fighting instinct and her training and her ability to deal with whatever's put in front of her. And this does lead to, unfortunately, Smitty getting a mangosh in his chest.
Yeah, this page was definitely really shocking to me when I first saw it.
Yeah, it is a character getting directly stabbed with a weapon, but it was something I wanted to show as very dangerous and very visceral. And this is the reason why Jean does wear this cloak. One of the reasons anyway. She's been hiding this mangosh on her back. And generally in fencing, a mangosh is a defensive weapon. But here, I wanted to show that this entire time that Jean had been hiding it in the same way that Parley had been hiding her teleporting abilities. And to show that Jean really is a force to be reckoned with here. And she is ruthlessly gone after what it is that is presenting her a problem during this fight.
So were you intentionally trying to show Annie kind of keeping a much cooler head than anyone else through all this? Or is it just that she's so focused on the task at hand that she can't handle anything else?
Well, I think that all the characters are pretty good at sticking to their tasks during the plan. Annie is more experienced in this side of things and kind of dealing with, I guess, people who have already died, really, which pretty much describes Jean and her boyfriend here. So when the kind of strangely reassembling corpse of the elf boy comes out of the river, she's not super disturbed by it. And she just calmly accepts the hair clip that he gives back to her. And this was lost when she fell into the water in Chapter 8.
Was it strange to draw the hair clip again?
Well, I'm not sure about strange, but I was happy to draw it again because it does provide me a way of having Annie's hair fall down on the side of her face without having to put it on the outside of her ear, which is what she's had to do this whole time. And so it did give me the chance to sort of frame her face slightly differently, and it does harken back to what her character design used to look like. And that does tie in with a lot of the things in this chapter coming full circle, since this is really the end of a plan that really started back at the beginning of the entire story.
You actually told me about this scene with Parley and Smitty here like 9 years ago when we first met, and I didn't believe you. And then when the scene started coming up on the Gunnerkrigg website, I was like, oh, that's exactly what he said would happen.
Yeah, I tend to do that. There's been plenty of times where I've actually spoiled something that seems completely unfeasible in the comic, and people have just not believed it. So... And I guess because I tend to plan those events far enough ahead that I don't usually get called out on it. So while we leave the unfortunate Smitty aside for a while, Annie steps in to do the final part of her task and leads Jean and her boyfriend off into the ether. And that does lead to this page, which for me was a very big event in the story. The mark that Jean put on Annie's cheek back in Chapter 8 was not only a constant reminder that Annie had something to do and she had a task left unfinished, and gave a visual cue to the reader that there was still this underlying thread with the ghost at the bottom of the ravine. I also kind of wanted it to seem like Jean giving Annie the mark in the first place was whatever semblance of humanity Jean had left in her was marking Annie in a way that she was asking her not to forget her. And so that kind of gave Annie the persistent motivation to go through all the previous years, developing her skills and finding friends that had the abilities that she needed, and gave Annie the motivation to finally go down and help Jean. And here, after those years have passed and all the work that Annie has done, Jean wipes the mark away, indicating that Annie's task is complete, and her boyfriend are left to drift off into the ether.
It's also been pointed out that when Jean gave her the mark, she was hurting Annie, but now that she's returned to her senses, she heals her instead.
I did want to show that after all the indication of just how dangerous Jean is and all the fighting that she's done up to this point, that is not really who she is. That was just the result of something that was done to her. And so now that she's been freed from these shackles, as it were, there is no animus towards Jean or what she might have done, especially to Smitty, who we'll get back to in a second. And so she wasn't so much an enemy that needed to be defeated, she was just somebody that needed to be helped, even if that person didn't realize that they needed help. And keeping with things coming back around, we switch back to Smitty, and then the psychopomps make their entrance. And they were also there back at the beginning with Annie and Jean, and they were actually the ones that gave her the task to try and help her.
I just wanted to say also that I like how you've drawn red and blue, just kind of staring dumbfounded, and I think that's kind of more realistic than them sort of breaking down over this, especially so soon after it happened. But I also wanted to say that it's always kind of nice to see the psychopomps, because I feel like they bring out a side of Annie we don't see anywhere else.
Yeah, she tends to be pretty angry when they're around, and that is her first reaction to Much, for example, when he comes and makes himself known all the way back in Chapter 8 again. And we do get the sense that there is something that really bugs Annie about them. Here, directly, we can see that Annie is pissed that she knows that these creatures can help her friend, but they're electing not to, unless she offers up something first, despite the fact that she has just gone through this ordeal, helping them with a task that they'd given her in the first place.
It always seemed to me here that the psychopomps were trying to dodge responsibility a little bit. They're being a little bit obtuse. Is that their aim here?
It may not be their aim, but it's definitely in their nature. So while they would fully admit that they did press Annie into doing this task for them, what they're trying to say here is that they at no point asked her to get other people involved and get other people hurt. But on top of that, they also see that there is no reason why they should do anything extra to Annie, like healing Andrew, even though they very easily can. And that's kind of the feel that I wanted to give to these psychopomps. I wanted them to seem very selfish and very businesslike, and creatures that were focused only on their task. And I suppose that is what the function of death is. There is no bargaining or negotiating with mortality. And so these creatures have no patience whatsoever to hear the negotiations of anyone that they might meet during their job. Except for Annie. She is in the unique position whereby she can offer one more thing and get them to help her out, which is what she does in this page here. And that will be explored later on in the story.
This definitely feels like a monumental moment for Annie, and I can't wait to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, it was the end of a lot of work, and despite a few bumps in the road, everybody came out of it in one piece, thankfully. And I felt that it was enough to just show the gang packing up and leaving without saying anything or sharing in their celebrations, and heading off back into the court, which is where this chapter ends.
Well, when I saw this last page, I was very worried about what was going to come.
Yeah, that was the feeling I was trying to get across. There is not much that slips Coyote's attention. And so this is not exactly a bonus page. It was the last time that I knew that I'd ever be drawing Jean and her boyfriend. And I guess I wanted to give them a bit of a send-off, but indicating that it's not exactly a happy ending that the two of them had. And with that, I don't feel that there's too much more to add to that. And with that chapter's over. So come back again for chapter 61. Red Friend gets a name too, I suppose.
I'm really excited for that one. Bye!